For a start, it's the only lecture series that is devoted to the history of science and technology. But it's also a unique and very special series for another reason. It's established to honor the memory of a member of our department and was established or spearheaded by another member, John Sherwood's wife and intellectual partner, Joan Sherwood. John Sherwood was a historian of modern France. He was a graduate of Columbia University and published a number of works, most notably George Mandel and the Third Republic, which was published by Stanford University Press. At Queen's, John made his mark both through his scholarship and his teaching, and as many of you know, it was John who brought History 121 to Queen's, nurturing generations of students' engagement with the intellectual traditions of the Western world. He is very fondly remembered by his students and by his family, including the Sullivans, the Kavanaughs, his 3 children, and his wife Joan. And we're so happy that some of them, at least, including Joan, could be with us here this evening. Joan Sherwood earned her degrees from Columbia and University of Toronto. She was also a distinguished member of our department for over 30 years. Like John, she shaped our curriculum in very profound ways, and in her case it was the introduction of courses in women's history, where she made her mark. They shared an interest in French history, and they also shared an interest in the history of science and technology. Joan's most recent book, published by Queen's McGill Press, was The Infection of the Innocents, and it was on wet nurses, infants, and syphilis in France. When John died in 1986, he was working on a book on the history of technology. This series, which was established with support from his family, his colleagues, and his friends, commemorates John Sherwood and his concern with the relationship between the humanities and technology. This series over the years has brought many distinguished scholars to Queen's. This evening is no exception. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael D. Gordin, Rosengarten Professor of Modern and Contemporary History and Director of the Society of Fellows in the Liberal Arts at Princeton University. I'm a Russianist, as some of you know, and as a Russianist, I've long been familiar, at least, and aware of Dr. Gordin's scholarship. His first book, A Well-Ordered Thing, Dmitry Mendeleev and the Shadow of the Periodic Table, is a fundamental work in the Russian history of science. An extension of his dissertation, which he completed at Harvard University in 2001, the book addressed not only the genesis of the periodic table, but the intimate relationship between science and the projects of political and economic reform. I didn't fully appreciate the breadth of Dr. Gordin's scholarship until I turned to his CV and to the library in anticipation of his visit here to Queen's. Dr. Gordin is truly a prolific scholar. He has published 6 historical monographs, including one that was written collectively. He has 2 more under contract. He's also edited or co-edited 6 volumes, including books and special issues of journals, and has published more articles than I was prepared to count. As striking as the volume of publications is the range of topics. From his start in late 19th century Russian science, he turned to the atomic bomb, nuclear intelligence. He then wrote a book on pseudoscience, a collective work on Cold War rationality, and most recently a book on the language of science, which is entitled Scientific Babble, How Science Was Done Before and After Global English. His research has moved seemingly effortlessly from the cultural and intellectual world of St. Petersburg at the fin siècle in the late imperial era to the corridors of power in Washington, DC, and Moscow at the very dawn of the Cold War. Throughout and through this very varied body of work, he's displayed an enduring interest in probing how scientific knowledge is constituted and accepted as knowledge, both within the scientific community, most importantly, but also beyond. This may not sound like the stuff of gripping narrative, but Michael Gordin is also a very gifted and engaging writer. And I had only to read the first few lines of his work, Red Cloud at Dawn, Truman, Stalin, and the End of the Atomic Monopoly, before being hooked. So I recommend his work. Over his career to date, Dr. Gordin has received multiple honors and awards. Among his many accolades are prizes for teaching, and mentoring, book prizes, and 2 particularly noteworthy honors. In 2001, he was awarded a National Endowment for the 2011 rather, he was awarded a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship and was named a Guggenheim Fellow. This evening, Dr. Gordin will speak about his most recent project, which is set in yet another new terrain, the Bohemian city of Prague. His talk is entitled, Identifying Einstein, Being German or Jewish in Prague and Elsewhere. So please join me in extending a warm welcome to our speaker.
Thank you very much for that over-generous introduction. I'm afraid it'll be downhill from there. I'd like to thank the Sherwood family for their generosity in endowing this, Ishita Pandey for the initial invitation, and to members of the history department, faculty, graduate students, and staff who made this possible. It's a real pleasure to be here. So I also want to thank everybody for coming on what is apparently the first fall break in the history of Queen's University. And I'm pleased that you took a day of your vacation to come here. So today I'm going to present a slice of a book that's that is currently, I think, completed, but I'm not sure, you'll tell me, which is entitled Einstein in Bohemia. And this is a slice that runs through several chapters of the project and covers one of the core arguments and themes of the whole. The project has changed quite a bit. I originally wanted to create a micro-history of Albert Einstein, and I'm afraid sometimes I will call him Einstein, just because that's how you say it in German, and there's no correct way of doing it. My point today is that there's no correct way of doing Einstein at all in identifying him. During one specific year, and I wanted to follow him around every day and find out what he ate and stuff like that, and then it became a sort of intellectual urban history of sorts. And now it's somewhere in between the two. I want to both recast the standard picture of Einstein and the standard picture of Prague that people may have walked into the room in. You might have a picture of one or the other of those things in mind. Before focusing on the strand that I'm going to follow, I want to lay out some context of both the man and his city. So this is Einstein's biography rendered as a list of places. So he was born in 1879 in the southern German town of Ulm. Before he was a year old, his family moved to Munich, where his father and uncle attempted to win the contract to electrify downtown Munich. They didn't end up getting that contract, but that was the city in which Einstein grew up as a child. Then his family moved to Milan. He stayed a year by himself in Munich before going to join them. Then he moved to Switzerland, to the town of Aarau, to prepare for examinations to enter the Federal Institute of Technology, or ETH, in Zurich. After graduating from there, famously, he was unable to get a job, so he became the world's most famous patent clerk in Bern. The second most famous patent clerk is Thomas Jefferson. And then from Bern, he eventually got an associate professorship, an extraordinary professorship, as it was called, in Zurich. Then he moved for his first full professorship in 1911 to Prague, which was something very extraordinary to happen to someone who was in his low 30s. That's extremely young for this period of time in the Germanic university system. He didn't like it very much. I'll explain why. And then he left after about three semesters, 16 months, to go back to Zurich, where he stayed for another 16 months before moving to Berlin. The Berlin period is the most iconic and productive period from 1914 until 1932, at which point he moves to the United States and to Princeton, where he lives the longest, from 1933 until his death in 1935. As you can see, the adult career after high school segments pretty cleanly into 3 kinds of places. So the Berlin years and the Princeton years are pretty straightforward, but that green bar there is kind of hard to identify as to what you would call it. And it's easier to render the chaos if you simply just say, oh, those are the Swiss years, which is, in fact, what the collected papers of Albert Einstein do. They're now in the Berlin years. They've gotten to about 1927. So you have the Swiss years, then you have the Berlin years, and eventually, presumably, you'll have the Princeton years. You can see the problem in that Prague is not Swiss. Which Einstein commented on a lot in his letters. There are many problems in the Einstein historiography, and one of them is segmenting it this way, as though it were clean all the way through. I would say the major concern about how one can talk about this person is that we tend to think of him biographically. There are specialist studies that look at little individual bits of Einstein's work, this way or that way, but most books are in some way organized around the whole life. In part because Einstein is probably unique as a scientific celebrity, and a lot of interesting things happened during the course of his life that he was involved with in some ways. World War I, World War II, the atomic bomb, the rise of Nazism, Zionism, etc. A lot of these biographies appear in English and then are translated and modified into German, or appear in German and are translated and modified into English. The scholarship is basically bilingual back and forth. There are features of his life that make him hard to grasp in a biographical mode, however. Most of the interesting physics for which he is famous were things he did when he was young, when he was relatively apolitical and not much of a public figure. Most of the interesting things and quotations and charm that people associate with Einstein happened when he was old and had hair that looked like that. And that is when he's doing physics that most scientists no longer think is at all interesting or even well thought out. So there's this young Einstein, old Einstein problem that is very hard to resolve in this mold. And it's distorting no matter how you look at it. In all of these books, Prague is very marginal. After all, he was only there for 16 months. How important could it be? And it is actually marginal in his scientific trajectory, in that what he does there does not become one of the canonical pieces of work for which he is famous. This is a moment in between his development of special relativity and quantum theory, which happens in 1905, and between his development of his full-blown theory of gravity, which is known as general relativity, which comes out in 1915, 1916. And what he's doing in Prague, I will tell you in a few moments. So this is a moment when the most famous scientist of the 20th century, and probably the most famous scientist ever, is an established figure in physics. Physicists know who he is. He's a familiar name, but he's not world famous. Your average person on the street would not have heard of him. That happens in 1919, which then very suddenly he's catapulted to world fame. You might think the fact that he's not famous and he isn't doing anything important is the reason why no one pays any attention to Prague. But I think that the omission is still surprising, based on a subgenre that I'll call Einstein in X. As you can see, there are certain clusters. So these are Einstein in Berlin. There's actually 5 books entitled that. This is Einstein in various Swiss places. Italy, Einstein in Paris. Einstein in Ulm has a whole book. He was there for less than a year. And it was pre-verbal. But still. But there's also no Einstein in Princeton, which is where he lived the longest, and I think that's a little bit strange. But Prague is missing from this zone. There is one book in Czech called Einstein in Prague, which isn't really a historical study. It's a 60-page collection of translations of an article and a preface he wrote to a book. They were available in German and in Czech there. It was edited by a cosmological physicist who's still working in Prague, and it was published in 1979, which is the centenary of his birth. It's not a historical work, however. But just because Einstein in Prague has not been done does not mean it's worth doing. And I'm going to try and persuade you that it was worth doing. So what's so special about Prague? So if you would go to Prague today, you will end up here, that little red thing there. That Prague is basically in the center of the Czech Republic, or what they like calling Czechia now, but I don't. So in the center of the Czech Republic, which is basically in the center of Europe. Overwhelmingly, when people write about Czechoslovak history, they write about Czechs and not Slovaks. When they write about Czech history, they write about Bohemians, not Moravians, which means they write about this half over here, not that half. And when they write about Bohemia, they really just write about Prague. And I'm doing the same thing, so I'm not changing that bias. This is now largely a mono-ethnic country. It's overwhelmingly people who identify themselves as Czechs. And almost an archetypal nation state. That was not the case for most of the history of this region, when it was extremely heterogeneous, and the series of traumas that lead to the death, emigration, forced or unforced, of large numbers of people over the course of the 20th century have transformed Prague into a city that is largely monoethnic and monolingual. Czech history often represents itself as teleological to the present, so that over time it's moving from this mess to something more and more coherent, which is an ethnic nation state. It's even more teleological than the Einstein historiography is towards a genius being grown through time. But this central Prague is not what Prague looked like on a map when he was there. It looked more like this. When Einstein was in Prague, it was the last years of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Habsburg Empire, and Prague is located right there. It's instantly provincial when you see it. But it's also, for a millennium, a major metropole of sorts for a large number of people. And Prague is both simultaneously provincial and metropolitan. And it's that oscillation between the two that I find interesting, in the same way that Einstein is in between being a world-famous genius and just another guy teaching at a university. Prague is halfway between Vienna and Berlin, so it's on the train line, so it's an important place in that period. The population of this region is mixed throughout, so Bohemia, this zone here, has about a population of 23% of people who identify themselves as Germans throughout the entire period up until 1945. Prague itself has a very different demographic, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But now to the city itself. This is what Prague looked like in 1911 from the Baedeker Guide. How many people here have been to Prague? Okay, so the rest of you should go. This is the Vltava River, or the Moldau in German. There's a big castle up here, the Hradčany, which is looms over the city and is very picturesque. Usually people start touring there, then they go down here to the Charles Bridge, big stone bridge with beautiful sculptures on it. They cross down here and they go to Old Town Square. It has an old astronomical clock. It's the first place someone was thrown out of a window in Prague. The second place, the more famous one's up there. The Old Town Square is here, and then this is Wenceslas Square, which was extremely visible during the 1968 Soviet invasion and then the protests at the end of the communist period. So that's the tourist part of Prague, which many people have been to. Einstein doesn't spend any time in any of those places. So he lived here at Šebitského ulice, number 1215, which is now Lesnická ulice, number 7. It's in the quasi-suburban, although it feels quite urban, region of Smíchov, which is relatively new, and he lives in a brand new building. He's the first occupant of it. Every day he would walk out of his house and cross the Polatsky Bridge, heading to his office, which is there at what was then Weinberggasse, number 3, or Viničná ulice today, number 3, and he just goes down, crosses the bridge, heads down there. It's about a 15-minute walk at a reasonably brisk pace, and he did that way. Notice that that back and forth totally bypasses Josefov, which is the Jewish quarter, or Josefstadt. He spent basically no time in this particular region, which is the classic center of Jewish Prague. It had been the ghetto and then was remodeled and modified just before he'd gotten there. So most of what I'm going to talk about today is the way in which Prague, his experience here, while not being directly involved with the Jewish sections of the city, managed to intercalate itself into his conception of himself as either Jewish or German, or both. So the short time that he was there managed to set a couple of patterns in his thinking and how other people treated him that become extremely important for how he conceptualizes himself over the rest of his life. So even though he never touched the core zone of Jewish Prague, it's important that it's there. And it's also important for me to note that his footprint on the city is both temporally very short and spatially very narrow. So even though it's that small a place, there's still significant resonances and ripples that come out of it. So many of you will probably heave a sigh of relief that this is not going to be a talk about physics, but it is a history of science talk, so I should say something about physics. There is some physics going on here, and so this is the science story you're not going to hear about. So, reflecting on Einstein's year in Prague, the major issue related to his technical scientific research, which is what most people think of as science, in the narrow sense, is that here he devotes for the first time all of his attention to working out a theory of gravity. There are, which is a generalization of his special theory of relativity. So he wants to incorporate acceleration into that, and he wants gravity to pop out of it. The story of general relativity breaks into 3 classical cities: Prague, where he starts, then Zurich, where he moves, and then popping back to Berlin, where he completes the theory. And that's where he is when he publishes it. There is, of these, there's a lot of work about the history of general relativity. All of it is about Zurich and Berlin. No one really talks about Prague. And that seems odd, because historians usually care about origins, and this is the origin of where he started working on it. But the reason why they don't is because everybody is focused on this set of equations. What this basically says, this is the shape of, sorry, I want to make sure I get this absolutely right. Yeah, this is the energy and momentum distribution in space. This is the shape of space. So it's that matter tells space how to curve, and then space tells matter how to move. That equation is what he does in 1915. And that's the result we now still use. It's one of the most accurate theories we have. And Einstein really gets on the path of that when he gets to Zurich. When he's on Zurich, he starts working very heavily on a set of notebooks called the Zurich notebooks, unoriginally, which he works on from the back and the front. They're incredibly hard to interpret. This very valuable study goes through the notebook page by page, explaining how, once he arrives in Zurich, he starts on a path that will eventually lead to those equations. So we have a history that tells us how he got there from when he's on what we know is the right track. What happens with, we can follow all the twists and turns and stuff like that, but we know he's going to end up there. When he's in Prague, he starts working on gravity theories, and they're all bad. They all don't work. And there's reasons, and interesting reasons, why that theory is a mess, but I'm not going to talk about those. But I want to focus on why he took so long. He came up with the idea of this gravity theory in 1907, and he doesn't start working on it until 1911 when he gets to Prague. And it's important that he's in Prague when he starts doing it. So why couldn't he focus on it? The reason why is quantum theory, which he had also initiated in 1905. In 1900, this man, Max Planck, came up with a theory of the heat distribution, radiation of distribution under heat, in a famous equation that predicted or explained that distribution through the fact that matter is in little chunks, that it is quantized. In 1905, Albert Einstein, that guy there, just figured out a way of explaining light as itself broken up into little chunks. And that's the beginning of quantum theory. Einstein is a major player in what is the most exciting topic in all of science. Gravity is not an exciting topic at this time. No one wants to work on it. In October 1911, a Belgian soap manufacturer named Ernest Solvay, who's there, convened a bunch of physicists together in Brussels and said, let's have a conference about about quantum radiation, the most exciting topic. Einstein's invited to give one of the 4 keynotes. He's by far the youngest person asked to give a keynote. And he goes there from Prague. In the conference proceeding, he's listed as an Austrian from Prague, which is very weird if you know anything about Einstein or Prague. That it would be labeled that way, but it's true. So he goes, he gives the talk, he has a very nice time, and then he comes back and doesn't touch quantum theory for a decade. Being in Prague enabled him to de-link himself from a very turbulent environment because it was perceived as a partial backwater. So he could actually work on the topic he wanted to work on, which was this gravitational theory. But while he's here, he meets a lot of interesting people, like Hendrik Lorentz and Marie Curie, who was the only woman in the photo, because she was the only woman there. And they make him very well known among other people, and immediately after he returns from this conference, he starts entertaining other job offers. He's only been in Prague for about 6 months. By December, this is October, by December he has another job back in Zurich, it's already set, and he's just a lame duck waiting out his time. He's extremely adept at negotiating tenure offers and things like that in a way that I was surprised at, given that he had no experience. But the point is that the backwater enables a certain kind of science to happen. And a similar marginality is at the core of the issue of Jewishness. So now I'm actually going to talk about what my argument is for today. So these 3 images suffice to, I think, illustrate a feature of German history that Einstein's time in Bohemia is especially well suited to explore. What exactly was Einstein, nationally speaking? The all-powerful Wikipedia fudges the issue. It says he's German-born, but usually they tell you what someone is. They say someone is Swiss or something like that, but not for Einstein. That's his Swiss passport, what he traveled on for most of his life, even after he was basically a German citizen. And this is him being sworn in with his secretary and his stepdaughter at Trenton to become an American citizen, which is what he is when he dies. The time I'm focusing on Einstein in 1911-1912, he was someone who was born a citizen of the German Empire, gives up that citizenship before he's 17, so he doesn't have to do military service, which is partially practical and partially ideological. And he adopted Swiss citizenship in 1901, and he was serving in the Habsburg civil service in Prague, where Germans make up, in Prague, only 7% of the population. 23% of the region, 7% in Prague. That's down from 50% about 50 years earlier. When he walks in, therefore, the locals think of him as German, but German can mean a bunch of different things. It can mean a Viennese, it can mean a local German from Prague, or it can mean someone from another German state. And he's a funny kind of German, and German history is also a funny kind of history because there are Germans all over different states which don't count as in our current conception of what Germany is. Pretty much German history almost always excludes Austria and excludes always the German parts of Switzerland, let alone Transylvania, the Volga region, or Pennsylvania. Einstein, which has a lot of Germans. Einstein exists in Prague superimposed in a set of multiple kinds of Germanness, at the same time that he basically rejects national distinctions for himself. But there's an added kicker to this. One of the most common ways people identify Einstein, that is, pick him out of a crowd, is that he is Jewish. My point today is to illustrate that this identification is first seated in Prague, this idea that the way to think about Einstein is as someone who is Jewish. And that's in part because of features of the local demographics. He self-consciously adopted this notion that he's fundamentally Jewish later. Of the 7% of German speakers in the city, half are Jewish, so it's a very large demographic. Einstein is neither a Prague Jew, he's not Viennese, and he's not German in the sense of being from Germany because he gave that up, and yet to some degree he's all of those at the same time, depending on who he's talking to. And the experience in Prague layers his German identification with an identification of himself as Jewish in ways that have lots of implications for how things work later. So I'm going to illustrate this with two stories, one at the beginning of Einstein's Prague career and one at the end. This is roughly what he looked like at the time he was there. It's a year later. Both are somewhat in between fact and unverifiable anecdote, and both are politicized at the time and in accounts later to prove various points. Einstein himself was part of that politicization. So the story at the beginning. The university in Prague, the German university, committee recommends a list of 3 people in 1910 to be hired for an open vacated position in physics. And Einstein is and they have to give them in rank order. The first person on the list is Einstein. The second person is a man named Gustav Jaumann, who taught at the technical university in the city of Brno, or Brünn, as the Germans would have called it, the German speakers would have called it. But that recommendation is not done by the university. They send it to the ministry in Vienna and to this man, Karl Graf von Storch, who is supposed to decide who's supposed to be hired. And von Storch reverses the order. He says, actually, number 1 should be number 2, and number 2 should... None of you have ever heard of Jaumann, so you don't think this is at all a good idea. But he says, no, we should offer to Jaumann, and Einstein will be number 2. This is understood at the time, especially by Einstein, as anti-Semitism. That's why he doesn't get the offer. And he complains about that in his letters. The physicist, who has not identified with either the religion or the ethnicity since he was 12, has been thrust into now having to think of himself, or having to think that others think of him as Jewish. Although von Storch's anti-Semitism was certainly one of the reasons for this thing, there are other reasons, such as the fact that Einstein is Swiss, not Austrian, which means giving this job, plum job to this, means that the job is filled. If you gave it to another Austrian, like Jaumann, then you'd have a new slot that you could put another Austrian in. And also the fact that Einstein's first wife, who would be coming with him, is Mileva Maric Einstein, who is a Serb, which is not a happy thing for people in Vienna to think about at this time. There's a great many tensions between, and they'll eventually erupt into World War I. And Jaumann comes from Brno, which is a nice town with a technical university, and he could get this promotion in Prague, and that would free up this slot. But there's an unreliable, so he's sort of local. There's an unreliable folk story that Yaumann turns down the job. We know he turned down the job, but supposedly the reason is because he found out he was originally number 2, and he was so resentful that he turned down the position. There's one source that says that, and everybody quotes it. It's probably not true. It's more likely that he had been in Prague. What's true is that he had been in Prague 10 years earlier. He knew the locals and he knew the conditions, and he wasn't exactly happy with the people who were there. And he has a really good gig in Brno. It's nice, it's close to Vienna, it's a place he wanted to stay. So he turns it down, and Einstein ends up getting the job in the first place. But the point is, for Einstein himself, he understood the whole position as part of the Habsburg state labeling him as Jew, that's what the job meant. As he would later put on several occasions, this was the first moment in his adult life when his consciousness of it being Jewish emerged. And he wasn't even in Prague yet. The second story is after the end, after he leaves, and it's basically a variant of the first, and von Storch is again in the center. In May and July of 1912, in Prague and Vienna newspapers respectively, there are 2 stories, 2 editorials on the front page attacking von Storch for the fact that Einstein is leaving Prague and going to Zurich. They say that basically von Storch has created an anti-Semitic climate, and that's why this wonderful, excellent scientist is leaving our city. As opposed to Germany, where this would not have happened, and actually Germany has a much more permissive policy towards hiring Jews in this period. Supposedly, Einstein had to, the story they both tell, and has been told many times later, is that Einstein had to declare his religion when he first arrived in the city. That's part of the policy of how you get a job. And he put himself down as what he always put himself down as confessionslos, meaning I have no religion, I am an atheist. You can't be an atheist in Habsburg, Austria, because you have to swear a religious oath that you're going to protect the emperor. So the officials cross it out and write in Mosaic, or Jewish. And he later says, this is when the Habsburg state made me Jewish by a form. We know he's listed as Jewish on these forms. We don't know whether this explicit romanticization actually happened. I'm uncertain about it. But it becomes part of the story. And once Einstein leaves Prague, his interval there becomes entirely defined by his Jewishness, by other people saying, you got here because you were Jewish, you almost didn't, and you left because you were Jewish. So that's a thing that he had no part of, but that other people have imposed upon him. These articles are interesting in part because they look unremarkable to us now because they say how wonderful Einstein is and how important and how great it would be if he were in Prague. And because we know Einstein's really famous, we think, of course. But in 1912, he wasn't really famous, and so it's just some physicist leaving. He's just a pawn in a newspaper war to attack a minister. They just pick him out. But if we don't realize that he wasn't famous yet, it looks like something really big has happened. But for most of the time Einstein was in Prague, though, he wasn't there thought of or identified as a Jew, he was identified as German. He's a professor at the German University. That is the name of the institution where he teaches. And that name and its history are tied to the language, not the ethnic identity. Depending on how you count, the German university, when he arrived, was either very old or very young. The university was founded in Prague in 1348 by the Emperor Charles IV. And I'm happy to talk about that if you guys want to ask questions about the long history. But for the sake of today, we're going to look at the young part, which is that in 1882, the state divides the university in half, into a German half and a Czech half, meaning German-speaking and Czech-speaking. People can enroll in whatever they want, but they create this divided university. The law, medicine, and philosophy faculty split in 1882. Theology is a little later. At first, German has all the resources, but then more students flow into the Czech university because it's the only university where you can study in Czech, as opposed to the many dozens where you can study in German. And the students can take courses at both, but basically Czech students take courses at the German university, no Germans take courses at the Czech. This split of a university on linguistic grounds is incredibly complicated. There aren't enough buildings, so they have to share the same buildings, so lectures happen on alternate days in the same classrooms, depending which university you are. The medical school has to move cadavers out of one room and into another room in order to make the thing arrange. It's extremely hard to do. But this story actually begins not in 1348, but in 1784, which is when the Emperor Joseph II removes Latin, the obvious language of the university, and for any university from 1348, and replaces it with German. even though Czech professorships were created. And after 1848, about half the university functions in Czech and half functions in German, but it's one university. There's a big fight about whether to split it, and it gets split. So my point here is that Einstein moves into a university and a town that was linguistically more than ethnically polarized, and his specific job is to teach physics in German. That's the nature of the job. So he's identified immediately by people as that kind of person. So did Einstein think of himself as part of a German identified culture war? Well, a bit yes and a bit no. So this is a letter he wrote in July of 1911, a few months after he got there. The population, for the most part, can't speak German and behaves itself with enmity towards the Germans. Then a few months earlier, right after he arrived, he comments about this almost immediately when he arrives. The animosity between Germans and Czechs seems significant. An example, I asked our institute's porter where one can get wool blankets. My predecessor, Herr Lippich, learns that he recommended to us a store owned by a Czech. He immediately sent his serving girl to me to ask that I buy the blankets at a German store. In another letter to another friend, otherwise it is less homey, meaning in Prague as opposed to Zurich. The Czech language, bed bugs, miserable water, these are constant tropes that Germans say about Slavs in this period. You can find them for St. Petersburg for anything. The Czechs are all in all much more harmless than one thinks, which is a very strange kind of compliment. But he's not ill-disposed towards the Czechs, but what you see in these letters, and there's a bunch like them, is first of all, he doesn't like Prague that much. It's not what he expected it to be. But also that he can't think about the city without thinking about it in nationalist terms, without automatically imposing categories onto the city that he picks up from his friends and colleagues, the people around him who talk this way. So he does notice this tension, but he doesn't notice it all the time. This is the Pulaski Bridge, the one that he crosses everyday work. Pulaski was a major figure in the 1848 nationalist revolutions. He's the major Czech-speaking figure of that period, and is one of the central figures of the nationalist mythos. This bridge is built in the late 19th century, and these statues you see on it here are this is the side Einstein lives on the far side. He would walk this way. These statues are figures from Czech mythology. It's usually draped in red, white, and blue colors, which are the colors of the Czech national flag. At this point, proto-national flag, because they don't have a state. At this period of time, the Czechs are actually competing as bohemians in the Olympics, separately from the Austrians. There's a lot of identifying yourself by contrast. This bridge is a contrast. It's designed to be a modern Protestant version of a Czech national bridge, as opposed to the Catholic Habsburg Charles Bridge, which is the one everybody goes to today. He'd have these reminders of Czech nationalism before his mind every single day when he crossed the bridge. He never comments about this stuff. But something even more dramatic happens. At this end of the bridge, in June 1912, while Einstein's still there, going to work every day, this is unveiled. This is a monument to František Palacký, the same guy as the bridge. It's huge. I mean, like, there's people here, you can see how big this thing is. It's unveiled while Einstein's going to work every single day, so they're working on it the entire time he's there. He has to walk past it, goes down to the left to get to the university, and he walks past it on the way back. There's Palacký, there's gigantic bronze sculptures of angels falling down, and they're all various moments from Czech history. It's a nationalist, anti-German statue. He sees it every single day. He never mentions it once. It doesn't show up at all. So while he does have these nationalist statements, he also can ignore it when he feels like ignoring it. So his status as a German in a world of Czechs, as a German in a world full of Czechs, is not always in his mind. How about Jewishness, which is a complicated question. Since the history of Jews in Prague is on the order of a millennium, the important part for our purposes is that the first decade of the 20th century is incredibly fraught. What changes is mostly on the Czech-speaking side as various nationalist boycott campaigns start, and Jewish businesses are identified as being German businesses, and you have a rise of political anti-Semitism on that side. At the same moment on the German side, most politics was liberal in the 19th century sense, and they needed the Jewish community to help them get votes. So there is a way in which your confessional status gets polarized as well. This makes the fact that the Germans court the Jews make the Jews even more suspect to Czech politicians and just perpetuates the cycle. So as Czech and German opposition gets more and more polarized, Jews have basically three options. They can assimilate to being Czech, which is what most of them do. Or you can assimilate to being German. Or you can become a Zionist, become a Jewish nationalist, and assimilate to neither. So Einstein can't do the first. He doesn't even aware that it's an option. The second is his default. And the third he learns about for the first time while he's in Prague, the idea that there is a thing that is Jewish nationalism. There's a lot to be aware of because in his social circles, there's an awful lot of Zionism that he runs into. But he doesn't run into them because he's looking for political or Jewish identification. It's because he's looking for someone to play the violin with. Before there are radios, if you play music, you need to find people to play music with. If you want to hear it, you have to make it. And he meets someone not far from this street in the Old Town Square. That woman is Berta Fanta, who is married to a pharmacist named Max Fanta, right on the Old Town Square at the Unicorn Pharmacy. He met her through a student, an auditor in his class, when looking for a place where he could play violin. And he ends up at her salon, so he shows up. He's older than he would have been then. So this is her second salon. She had a previous philosophical one, but that doesn't matter. The second one was set in her apartment, not in a cafe, where the first one was, and it gravitates around Zionism as a topic. Einstein attended for a bit under a year, and he was put in touch with two figures who play an important role in Einstein's associations with Zionism, to greater or less degree. The first is Hugo Bergmann, who is also Berta Fanta's son-in-law. He's a philosopher trained in the school of Franz Brentano, and he's there with his first wife, Elsa Fanta. The second is the Prague-born German novelist Max Brod, who I can say a lot about later, but I'm going to bracket him. He's a separate chapter in the book. So Bergmann, though, let's talk about him. He's familiar to some people as Shmuel Hugo Bergmann. He emigrates to Palestine and then becomes a rector and dean at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, a very significant German philosopher and scholar. When he met Einstein and his mother-in-law Salon, he'd recently become electrified by Zionism as an idea, the idea that he could identify himself as Jewish as his nationality, by a series of lectures given in Prague by Martin Buber, which are given in German, and they're translated very broadly. Bergmann and a few other Prague colleagues, including Brod, break off from the German reading hall where they used to hang out and form a student club called Bar Kochba, which is the centerpiece of German-speaking Jewish Zionism. And they have a journal called Self-Defense, which is their main literary journal, which Bergmann edits for a while. Einstein doesn't really care for Prague Zionism when he interacts with it. When he comments on it to people at the time and the few years afterwards, he thinks of it as a medieval, mystical, nationalist idea. It's all about national identification, and Einstein is anti-nationalist. And also relied on identifying himself as a Jew, and that's something he wasn't invested in, although everybody else around him seemed to be. So he does very little in 1912 with this. He goes, he plays the violin, he talks about Kant with some people, and then he doesn't interact. Bergmann emigrated to Palestine and around 1920, shortly after World War I, and with Buber and others founds Brit Shalom, which is a particular movement, small movement within the Jewish settlement in Palestine, which is interested in a binational state, or binational country, region, where people would know both Arabic and Hebrew, and they would interact together with the Arab community as a binational zone. The idea for this kind of Brit Shalom idea comes directly out of its leadership's existence as a linguistic minority in either Poland or in Bohemia, where they had to speak German and while surrounded by another language and experience what linguistic marginalization is like. So there's a very close tie between the politics of Prague and the Zionism that ends up this particular movement within Zionism. Einstein eventually becomes interested in this particular kind of in Brit Shalom, and he supports it in the 1920s. In 1912, Einstein moves back to Zurich and doesn't think about Zionism again at all. And he starts to think about it again in 1918, when he became concerned during World War I about discrimination, partially by Berlin Jews, to the East European Jews who were flooding in as refugees into the city. And he thought of that as bad. and spoke out openly about the need to find a place for these people so that they aren't treated terribly. What's interesting about that is that his interest in Zionism emerges out of his pacifism, primarily, not out of a self-identification. And then something else weird happens. Right after the war ends, Einstein becomes hugely famous because an eclipse expedition has verified that theory that was published in 1915. It's still a little mysterious why an eclipse expedition verifying a theory would make Einstein on the cover of every single newspaper, but it actually did, and he showed up everywhere. In the US, Germany, France, Britain, Einstein is everywhere. This is on a major Berlin magazine. His theory becomes all the rage. And at this time, he gets approached by Zionists to ask whether he would lend his support to the movement as a way of raising funds, perhaps for a university in Jerusalem that would be a place where Jews could go outside of the quota limits that most European states, although not the new Czechoslovakia, have imposed on Jews. The key person who approaches him and puts him in contact with this movement is Hugo Bergman, who's then working in London. So the Prague connection is the connection that draws him back into the movement. In spring of 1921, Einstein agrees to sail on a ship with Chaim Weizmann, who's a chemist who becomes the first president of Israel, and to help gather funds for the university. Bless you. And he's greeted by huge, excited crowds. This is Einstein riding in a car in the streets of New York, that's him, and there's like several people deep cheering this guy. He uses his newfound fame to support the project of a Hebrew university, and he writes publicly about it, how I became a Zionist. The culturalist Brit Shalom mission appeals to him, and on his way back from a trip to Japan the following year, he stops in Palestine on the way and gives a speech on Mount Scopus, which was the original site of the university. That's his only visit to the region ever, and in the peak of his interest. He gets progressively disillusioned with the movement as time goes on, especially after a 1929 rebellion by the Arab population, which is crushed with violence by the British, who have the mandate, and he's disgusted by it. And he gets progressively alienated from the movement. By 1938, he says he would rather see just relations between the Arabs and the Jews than a Jewish state, and he backs out of the movement. Famously, he was offered the presidency of Israel in 1952 as the second president when Weizmann died, and he turned it down, much to the relief of Ben-Gurion, the prime minister. The visibility of Einstein as a pacifist and a Zionist brings him to the attention of an increasingly active anti-Semitic movement, so when he becomes famous, an anti-Semitic movement that's growing politically sees that and latches onto relativity theory as a thing that they have to attack, which again redefines Einstein as Jewish publicly. This culminates in a thing called the Anti-Einsteinbloom, the Anti-Einstein League. There's a good deal of hostility in the 1920s in the German radical right. This is a book by Milena Watzek, Einstein's Opponents, which is translated into English. That's an excellent book on this. After the German Prime Minister Walter Rathenau was assassinated, in part because he's Jewish and in part because he signed the Versailles Treaty, Einstein has to go into hiding because he's on the same hit list by the paramilitaries, when it's found. This book goes into a lot of detail about it. I only want to talk about one particular person who's based in Prague, who's part of the anti-Einstein group. This man, Oskar Krauss, was a philosopher at the German university. He was from a Jewish family, an assimilated Jewish family, born and educated in Prague at the German university. He becomes a great disciple of the Austrian phenomenologist philosopher, proto-phenomenologist philosopher, Franz Brentano, and he, in 1890, becomes a protege of one of Brentano's students, and begins to teach as an extraordinary professor, an associate professor basically, at the German university in 1911, the same year Einstein arrives. They don't seem to interact, even though they're on a very tiny faculty with each other. In 1916, he becomes a full professor, and he begins to get into a series of disputes with Einstein's successor in Prague, a man named Philipp Frank, who is one of the co-authors of the, who's one of the people who's the founder of the Vienna Circle, one of the leading movements in philosophy of science in the 20th century. Philipp Frank is a major positivist thinker. So Krauss and Frank fight a great deal. They fight mostly about relativity theory, which for some reason Krauss thinks is clearly incoherent. He has a critique based on how you measure velocity, which I can talk about if you'd like. So Krauss publishes a lot about relativity starting in 1921, a very large amount. Einstein comes to visit Prague in 1921 to lecture, and Krauss debates him on stage, mostly heckling him, and Einstein basically ignores him. So Krauss publishes a book called Open Letters to Albert Einstein, and Max von Laue in 1925, which has, it's a very angry text. Einstein ignores this one too. The battle with Frank, though, becomes more pitched as time goes on, and Prague is a center of disputation between pro and anti-relativity, and also pro and anti-different approaches to what a philosophy of science should be like. In 1931, Krauss, who is a baptized Jew, he was baptized so he could get a position as a professor at the university, participates very visibly in a very hostile book called 100 Authors Against Einstein. He's on the title page. He and the editor, a guy named Israel, are the only two with Jewish names in the entire book, and they're specifically highlighted in order to make the thing look less offensive. So this battle continues until 1938, when the Munich deal between Hitler, the British, and the French means that Czechoslovakia is partially dismembered. Frank was already on a lecture tour in the United States, and he just stays. Krauss remains in Prague. In 1939, he's arrested by the Gestapo, interrogated, and then released. He flees to Britain, where he dies in 1942. He's lucky. Not everybody was lucky that way. This is Emil Nohel. He was from a Czech village, but went to the German university. He was a student there of Georg Pick, who was Einstein's closest friend while in Prague, a mathematician. So this is someone from a Czech Jewish village who decided he was going to professionalize himself this way. Pick recommends him to be Einstein's first assistant while in Prague. And they work together for a little bit, but Einstein and Nohel don't get along. So basically fires Nohel. Nohel ends up getting a job at the highest gymnasium in Vienna, where he teaches math and physics to smart Jewish students, which is what his job ends up being, and he stays there for decades. This is the only gymnasium, the only secondary school for Jews that's kept open after the German annexation of Austria in 1938. One of the students there is a man named Walter Kohn, I should say, who wrote memoirs about Nohel. It's one of the few reasons I can find out anything about him. Kohn ends up getting out on the Kinder transport and ends up in Canada, where he stays for a while, studies, and he eventually settles at University of California, Santa Barbara. He wins the 1998 Nobel Prize for Chemistry. And he always credits Nohel for invigorating this view, the love of science. So here's one of the few photos from that context. It's very blurry. Sorry about that, that's Nohel right there. Nohel tries to get out of Vienna after 1938, but can't. He writes letters to Einstein, writes letters to lots of people in the US saying he knows Einstein. They write to Einstein and say, is this real? And he goes, yes, you should try to get him out. Try to get him out. Didn't work. He wasn't able to do so. He goes to the countryside into hiding, and then he hears that his whole village, where he came from, has been rounded up and all the Jews taken away, and he decides to turn himself in. So he does. And he turns himself in, and he is sent to Theresienstadt, and then eventually to Auschwitz, where he's killed. How do I know all this? I know this because when he was in the countryside in hiding, he writes very long letters to his son, Yeshayahu Nohel, who he sent to Palestine and who emigrated there in the 1920s. And he writes him long letters and somehow sends them. They're all in the Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial Site in Jerusalem, and they're there as a testament of how Einstein's connection, they end up, Einstein's in these letters in lots of places, and it's another way in which Einstein gets imbricated into another story of Jewishness. So the experience of being Jewish in Prague gets conflated for him in a lot of ways with his experience in National Socialism, with the people he knows about and knows are being persecuted back from that time. I'm going to give one final example. This is a letter that Einstein writes to Planck. I'll read it in a second so you don't have to strain yourselves now. This is right after the Nazi seizure of power. So they're elected, and then there is basically a coup within the elected government where the Nazis seize control of the state. Einstein was agitating very publicly for sanctions and international rejection of what's happening in Germany. And Max Planck writes to him and says, please don't do this, don't be so loud, because every time you do this, it gets the Nazis really excited and upset, and we're just trying to moderate them, we're trying to solve things in here, so if you just shut up for a little bit, we can maybe make some progress. And to persuade Planck, he says, no, actually I'm not going to shut up, and let me explain why. And this is the letter he writes. That you may better appreciate my feelings, I ask you to imagine yourself for the moment in this situation. Assume that you were a university professor in Prague. A government came into power which would deprive Czechs of German origin of their livelihood, and at the same time employ crude methods to prevent them from leaving the country. Assume further that the guards were posted at the frontiers to shoot all those who, without permission, attempted to leave the country that waged a bloodless war of annihilation against them. Would you then deem it decent to remain a silent witness to such developments without raising your voice in support of those being persecuted? There's a couple of interesting things about this letter. One is there's this Sudetenland, Sudeten German language that he's using as an analogy, and which Hitler had been using as an argument for why Bohemia should be annexed to the Reich, in this letter. But what's also interesting about it is this imagine you were a professor at a university in Prague is not an imagined thing for Einstein. Einstein had been a professor at a German university in Prague and had felt himself marginalized as being German. So the way he tries to persuade a German professor of the experience of persecution of Jews is through an analogy of his experience as a German professor feeling persecuted in the same way. And there's this just complicated mess where the Prague 16 months becomes compacted with a large amount of ways in which he thinks of himself as German, as Jewish, as many other things. The place that that linkage happened was Prague. So that's basically where I want to stop, but I want to make one point as an epilogue. It concerns the Czechs, who I've basically not mentioned in this story, and how Einstein's ambiguous Germanness, the fact that he's both German and not German, plays out among them. This is the house where Einstein lived, this nice Art Deco house. And this is the place where he worked on Weinberggasse. It still looks basically like this. And these photos don't show a lot of activity in either place, and that's because there isn't a lot of activity in either place. The Physics Institute is still here, and sometimes when classes are on, you see people, but otherwise you don't, and nobody goes to this place here. And in Prague, a place where there are no tourists is actually kind of interesting. On the 18th of April 1969, after the Soviet invasion, and partially as a distraction to that, the local youth newspaper Mlada Fronta publishes an article asking whether Prague has forgotten Einstein. He was here, he was one of us, and we don't commemorate him at all. As a result, there's some activity to put up a plaque outside both places commemorating Einstein. They're both in Czech, and they're both also way too old. Einstein was not that old when he was there. This is actually pretty surprising. These are, as far as I can tell, the only plaques before the end of communism that have ever been erected in Prague to a professor at the German university. Lots of famous Germans taught at the German university. There are no plaques to them. Some of that is because of continuing animosity. Some of that might be guilt for the fact that the Czechs expelled like over 1 million Germans at the end of the war, forcibly and with some violence. But it's just, there isn't much of that. But Einstein's kind of perfect. He's not a Habsburg German. He's not Viennese. He's not a local Prague German. He's Jewish, so he can like stand in for the Holocaust and other violence done against them. He's got the right politics for the state because he's kind of a socialist and an internationalist, so the communists are kind of okay with that. And he's really famous, so he makes them look like they're cosmopolitan and international. So the audience for these plaques is Czech, and it's a very specific kind of domesticating of Einstein's image as a special kind of German, a different kind of German. Today, though, the most elaborate monument, the one you'll see if you go to Prague, is this one, which is in the Old Town Square outside of Berta Fanta's home. It's bilingual. There's English down here, which is a tip-off that it's not for the Czechs. It's for the tourists, for you. And the image is also ridiculously old. That's like right before he died. But the image of Einstein in Prague only becomes significant within the context of the communist regime, but that's a much longer story. Very quick conclusion. Even though Einstein thought he was moving through Prague with very little impact, and that it didn't matter much, he didn't matter much to the city, and it didn't matter much to him in terms of the final version of general relativity, or to his politics, or later life. It was only 16 months in a long life. The place and the person left multiple imprints on each other. history shapes you even if you don't know it's doing it. And that happens both while you're alive, for the German Jewish national Einstein, and even after his death, even if you never went to the Jewish sector of the city. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to take questions, but I don't know who any of you are, so I can't.
It's open for questions. Just
Yes?
When did the Germanization of Bohemia speed up? My impression is that Czech had almost died out in a way that Irish almost died out, and then things were turned around. A professor told me that Plaques had to write his history of Bohemia in German in the first place because he didn't know Czech.
He did write the first volume in German, the second volume in Czech. Plaques knew Czech, but he wasn't able to get a publisher for it.
Okay.
But you're actually absolutely right. So the first community that's there, as far as we can tell, is largely Slavic of some kind, the ancestors of the modern Czechs. But very early on, in part because we're talking around now 800, 900 AD. You get an influx of Germans because silver is discovered and the mining technology comes from there, and you have a community. The moment at which Czech starts being suppressed very actively as a language is after 1620. So in 1618, the defenestration of Prague happens, which is the beginning of the Wars of Religion, the 30 Years' War. By 1620, the Prague part of that is over because the Austrians have conquered Prague and perceive, not incorrectly, that speaking Czech is tied to this Protestant stuff, which is tied to the community. So therefore, it needs to be stopped. So the Counter-Reformation in Bohemia is extremely aggressive, and Czech basically stops appearing as a published language. So the documents all go silent. They all go German or Latin. There's still, however, a very large amount of Czech that's happening in the countryside. So the peasants still speak Czech. There's still a lot of Czech there, but the intellectual classes, the institutions of state, they're all in German. You start getting a resurgence of that, of Czech in the very late 18th century. And Plaques moves to Prague in part to be part of that. He speaks Czech, but he knows that you shouldn't speak Czech in those kinds of elite places. And part of why he's lionized as a hero is that he creates a space where public Czech intellectuals can work. So his first volume of his history of Bohemia is in German, volume 2 is in Czech. And so there is a transition that happens there. But that resentment of Vienna imposing German on them lasts for a very long time. And I would say the moment when it really tips the other way is 1848 with the nationalist revolutions across Europe. But Plaques was formed in the moment of the demonization of that. I believe he's born in 1798, something like that. So he's at the moment when German is officially installed at the universities as the language of the university. Latin had been, in a sense, a neutral thing, because everybody had to learn Latin. It doesn't really matter one way or the other. The introduction of German, which was supposed to be a democratizing, or at least simplifying, modernizing move, had this effect of triggering memories of the Battle of White Mountain, which is what happened in 1620, which is the course of suppression. But there's a very long history, and Czechs and people who had been Bohemian but had been, so people who live in Germany whose ancestors grew up in Bohemia and who were expelled will talk at great length about minute details about who started this fight first. But there's no question that there was two communities there, and there was injustice done to both at different times. But the Czech suppression of Czech as a written language is a very dominant feature of the 18th century. It's very late 17th and 18th century.
And the tipping point is 1848.
The tipping point back is 1848. There had been a resurgence. Plaques, most of his work is before then, but the reason why he's seen as a nationalist hero is because in 1848, he's able to marshal enough support to indicate the university, even though it's officially still a German language university, and other institutions need to accept Czech as a language of instruction and a language of being. and you start getting a rise of a very prominent Czech language press, which had been censored more heavily before. Yes, sir.
Is the anti-relativity movement different in Europe from in the United States? I mean, as I remember the man of Oxford's argument that the American one was significantly anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
It's all wrapped up in anti-Semitism. Is the same sort of thing going on in Europe? And then how is Krauss relating himself to, if it is, then how is Krauss relating himself to anti-Semitism?
It's a great question. It's mostly anti-Semitic. So like I would say 95% of what you see is anti-Semitic, and there's a 5% intellectual core that varies depending on who you talk to. So it's similar in that regard between Europe and the United States. The Krauss is in a weird position because he has what he thinks are well-founded critiques of relativity theory. They're derived from having read popularizations of relativity, in part written by Einstein himself, that he interprets slightly incorrectly. He recants at the end of his life and writes Einstein a letter in English, weirdly, where he says, did I get it right now? And Einstein never responds to that either. But Krauss's position is strange because he knows the movement is anti-Semitic, and he knows that he is born Jewish, although he is baptized, and therefore these people think of him as also bad in some way. However, they also need him because they make the movement look like it's not just anti-Semitic. They make the movement look like it's intellectual. There's one meeting in 1920 that he's, 1920 or 22, I think it's 20, where he's supposed to go to speak at a meeting in Germany. And there's two variants of why he doesn't go. The German right-wing press says he was denied a visa by the German state because they're protecting their prize Einstein from criticism. The thing that seems more true is that he refuses to go because he sees how anti-Semitic it's going to be. And he doesn't want to be associated with that part of the movement. But he knows who his bedfellows are. He writes letters to these people. He knows what they write in other places. I'm not psychologically adept to try and figure out how he reconciled that, but it's clear that it was difficult for him. Yes?
So at the end of his, near the end of his life, he becomes an American citizen.
Yeah.
And what prompts him to make that decision? Is it just convenience, or is it safety? Or?
It's a very good question. Like, so he's technically, so I'm going to give you a long answer to it, but I think it's interesting. So when he moved to Prague, he was supposed to become an Austrian citizen and give up his Swiss citizenship. He just never does, and no one checks. So he's still a Swiss citizen. Then he moves to Berlin, and they say, you're going to become a German citizen. He goes, no, I'm going to become a Swiss citizen. I'm going to stay that way. And no one enforces it because they're so happy he's coming. And it doesn't matter at all. Except when he's on his trip to Japan, he gets the Nobel Prize in Physics. And so he can't go pick it up. What happens then is your ambassador goes to pick it up. So the Swiss ambassador shows up and says, like, okay, where do I pick it up? And then the German ambassador shows up and says, and so it becomes an issue. And there's much back and forth, and he keeps the Swiss passport, but it is understood that he is primarily a German citizen. And they basically declare this, and he writes back and says, I'll agree with this version of your historical reconstruction that I mentioned. So he's a German citizen until 1933, when he's living in the US at that time because he had been visiting Caltech, and then he moves to Princeton, and the German state rescinds his citizenship. So he's stateless. And he's a refugee. He's the world's most famous refugee. While there, he's like, well, what am I going to do now? And he decides, both because of necessity, but also because of the principles of the Constitution and equality, etc., that he wants to be an American citizen where it will not be tied to his confessional background. I should say that Einstein was extremely active in supporting civil rights movements for African Americans throughout this entire period. Princeton was a largely segregated town for the time he lived there, and he would cross that border back and forth, and would accept honorary degrees only from historically black colleges and universities. So he has a very specific understanding of what it means to be an American. And when the McCarthyist persecution of anti-communists happens, he also says, this is un-American. What you guys are doing is un-American. So he chooses that partially for ideology and partially because he is stateless. Because they rescind his citizenship. They forget to rescind his membership in the Prussian Academy of Sciences. And they have to do it in 1938. It's kind of embarrassing because it's going to be public that they did it and that they had to wait so long. So, but anyway, that's the long answer to that. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, sorry.
This is just an aside, but you mentioned the Pennsylvania Dutch, the Germans. You're right in the heart of the United Empire loyalists, and apparently 40% of them spoke German as a first language.
Oh, I did not know that. It's I mean, if the most common second language besides English, the most common language besides English spoken in the U.S. until about 1920 is German as well. When the U.S. joins 1917 in World War I, 23 states criminalized the use of German in public forms. That's overturned by 1923. Some of them passed those bans after the war's already over. But that damage there is done, and there starts to be mass assimilation and suppression. Although you still find heritage speakers of German in Minnesota, Wisconsin, etc. from then. So like that's like 5 generations since immigration, where I met people when I was an undergraduate who spoke Minnesota accented German perfectly because that's what their grandmother spoke to them. But I didn't realize that about here too, although it does make sense. Yes?
Thank you for the talk. It was great. I have 2 questions. One sort of already been answered. It was about identity, I guess. So when Einstein is in the United States, does he identify himself then as an American? Like you were saying, he likes his American values, but would he consider himself an American if he's sort of anti-nationalist the way you were describing? And also, how does the Jewish community in the United States, do they try to claim him and be like, in the way that people do because he's a scientist, because he's smart, like he's one of ours type of thing? And the other question, sorry I have so many, is about when you're talking about the Prague period, what kind of sources are you using to find out about it? Like, and this is one particular example you're saying where he walks this way to work. Like, how do we know how he walks?
Yeah. So those are great questions. I'll answer them in out of order. But yes, the U.S. community claims him as Jewish very, very loudly. Like he's one of the most famous people in the United States, and even before then, as soon as he becomes famous in 1919, the Jewish community globally claims him. He's a very visible sign of what Jews can achieve in a way that's, Sigmund Freud is in a different kind of position, but is similarly picked up and held up in a variety of ways. So yes, they do claim him. Although he doesn't go to services, he doesn't do any of those things, and he's quite public about his views about God, which God exists, but God is not a personal God. God doesn't like have the attributes of intention or something like that. God is like another word for nature. But it's theistic in some way. There are various rabbis who discuss that. There are also various Catholic priests and Protestant ministers who discuss what Einstein's religion would be. As for thinking himself as American, he doesn't think of American as a nationality, which I know in Canada is going to sound strange because Americans are very national. But he thinks of it as a multinational country, where there's lots of people from lots of different origins, and therefore it's okay to be an American citizen. In the same way, it's okay to be a Swiss citizen because the Swiss have Germans and French and Italians, and therefore it's not national. So he also needs a passport. At the same time, though, he is very supportive of the World Federalist Organization, which is a one unified world government, which is largely a reaction not so much to national sovereignty, although it's partially that, but to the atomic bomb and what would be required for that. So he does have that point of view as well. The last point about sources. We have a lot of letters. I have to say, the way he walked to work is what I reconstructed, because Einstein didn't usually he would ramble on walks when he wanted to, but when he went to and from work, I know he usually used to go directly based on Princeton sources and Berlin sources, so I didn't generalize that. But we do have a lot of letters. We have various newspaper reports. There's a lot of memoir stuff, which I tried to treat gingerly because they're all post-fame, and therefore people color it. Like, people are all like, oh yeah, I was in the room with Einstein at this day, and the thing is, you weren't in the city in the same year, so. So I try really hard to check those. Part of the reason why you can find out a lot about this time period is the most famous Prague citizen ever is Franz Kafka, who lives at exactly the same time and met Einstein exactly once. Neither of them remember it afterwards. They both have opportunity to remember it. The other one becomes famous in the lifetime of each, and yet neither of them seem to register it. He remembers Max Brod, who was Einstein's editor, very well. Kafka's editor very well. But because of Kafka, there's a huge Kafka industry which has like really just kind of hoovered up every bit of cultural anything that we can find out about this time period, this pre-World War I Prague, and so you're actually able to get a lot of density about where people hung out, about the Salon. I know a lot about the Salon, not because Einstein went there, but because Brod and Kafka went there, and people have helped assemble those letters. So there's a lot of correspondence that's at the heart of this stuff, but there's other sources from other places as well. The memoir stuff is the trickiest to deal with. His oldest son was 8 at the time, and he has memoirs too, and he has certain vivid memories of Prague that I feel like I can also only use gingerly because there are many decades there. But I'm trying to pick out sources carefully so that I can tell this without exaggerating. Yes?
You're telling a very interesting story about Einstein's identity being transformed and affected by the social circumstances and physical circumstances, I guess, of Prague. Was his sense of identity then or later shaped by his science? Was his understanding of gravity, of light, of existence, did that have any effect on how he thought about himself or society?
So you're not asking whether his sense of himself as Jewish or German affected the science. You're asking the other way around. But there's no question that Einstein thinks his fundamental identity is that he's a physicist. Like he's on a quest for truth in nature. That's what thinks he is always about. Except for all the times when he's very public about things like African American civil rights and Zionism, like pacifism, etc. But it's clearly very important to his core that he thinks there is a reality, and that reality is intelligible to us through mathematics and science, and that means certain things about the understandability of the world, our place in that world, and since we're able to understand it, and it links very much to his sense that nature and God are kind of the same thing, and that's very important for him understanding his place in it. So there's definitely a way in which the science shapes, very importantly, a core sense of himself. But like his notion about whether he's German or not, it pops in and out depending on context, right? Like we all think of ourselves as something else in different contexts. We don't have one thing that we are all the time, and that's the same is true for him, although when you see him on dorm room posters, they usually emphasize the science side overwhelmingly, which for someone who is incredibly social and actually interacted with a large number of people, he's depicted and depicts himself as a loner who basically just spends his time thinking about science, which is true and not true, as some things are. Yes?
The state of Israel was created in 1948. What were Einstein's feelings about that? Politics.
It's a great question, very mixed. So he was an ardent supporter of the Hebrew University. He thought that that was a wonderful institution because Jews are discriminated against in educational institutions, so broadly there should be such a thing. But that's established in the 20s. It's already before the state. When the state is founded, he's not happy about it. In part, he's in a sense happy that there is a place where Jews won't suffer discrimination. He thinks the US is becoming that place too. But he doesn't like that it was a war that started it, that the independence happens with an Arab-Israeli war. He doesn't like that the factions that are very influential in the early state are the revisionist factions who are highly militarized and national identified. National in the bad sense. So he thinks of himself as affiliated with Jewish nationalism in a kind of a cultural way, but when you think of a nation as having an army and a sense of other people not being, as exclusionary and other people are not related to you, he opposed that kind of way of thinking, and certain segments of the early Jewish state were like that, and so he had mixed views towards it. But doesn't speak up very heavily about it because he also supports other things that the state is doing as a home for refugees and as a welcoming place of sorts. So he's of mixed mind about it, but that is part of the reason in '52 he turns down the presidency, is he doesn't think, first of all, he has recognition, his health was not great. He also has a recognition of his own capacities for doing that kind of public organizational outreach stuff. The presidency is largely ceremonial, but that would require a lot of ceremony and tact and things he doesn't think he does well, accurately. And the third part is I think he knows that he wouldn't be able to keep his mouth shut about some of the things that he doesn't like. And so that his views were quite mixed. There's actually, this is a very ginger area of scholarship, and so a lot of people haven't dug this deeply into it. We have a very good study, it's an excellent book called Einstein Before Israel, which is about him until 1933 and his views of the Zionist movement, so before the Nazis. But once the Nazis get involved, it changes how he feels about things, and once the state is militarized, it changes how he feels about things in very complicated ways. So it's a great question. I wish I had an easy answer, but there isn't one. Yes?
So kind of answered these other questions, but I'm just wondering, why do you think there's a good way to explain why he was anti-nationalist?
It's a very deeply held view. So he's anti-nationalist before he's 17 years old. That's why he gives up the draft. I mean, that and also that is a draft that he doesn't want to do. But he's happy to move to Switzerland and Italy and so on. Some of it, different people have, different historians have focused on different parts. He has an intellectual critique of national sovereignty, which he thinks is a tool states use to suppress minority communities within their borders. Part of the reason he thinks that is he was heavily taunted as a Jew when he was a student in Munich, and so he has a view about Bavarians and southern German nationalism that he doesn't like. So part of it is a critique of that. Some of it is a view that states, when you have national sovereignty, that intrinsically and inevitably leads to war. And his pacifist views are very deep. They start when he's a teenager and run most of his life without interruption, although there are various moments where he endorses. So there's a question about whether people should be conscientious objectors to the draft in the 1930s when it's clear that the Germans are mobilizing. And his earlier position would have been, yes, you should be a conscientious objector to the draft, but he doesn't say that anymore. He does some limited amount of research for the war in the United States, not on the atomic bomb, and most of the reason he doesn't do that is because he's a security risk. He blabs. He's not reliable. The military do not trust him on these regards. But he does do some war work, right? Which is you're not supposed to be doing. In World War I, he manages to not do any war work, but that's because the military thinks he's Swiss. So he's a foreign national, so they can't enroll him into the effort. They would have tried otherwise, and he would have said no, and the Swiss is a good excuse. So the war part is another big aspect of why he's anti-national.
Just a follow-up question. Yeah. Do you know anything about his parents and like maybe why he's a pacifist?
I actually think that is an intellectual position he comes to. I think I don't know enough about like whether he was beat up at some point and something about fist. I honestly can't say anything like that. But it's very early on, that is from when he starts leaving records and things, his hostility to military conflict is quite strong. He's born in 1879. The German Empire is 8 years old at the time when he's born. And so he grows up in an environment where the military prowess of Germany is very much on display, and something offends him about it. It could be intellectual, it could be partially aesthetic. I don't really know how to rooted, but it seems like as far back as we have views about Einstein, we have reliable testimony about what he was like when he was young. This is there very early on. And it's something that's mostly consistent, although he does sign the letter asking Roosevelt to initiate an atomic bomb research program, for which Gandhi writes a letter to him saying, that's not cool that you did that. And there's a lot of, so like, he does compromise on those views at some later points in his life. No problem.